Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's really a pleasure to talk about digital democracy today as part of this year's lecture series on practicing democracy in the digital age. My name is Rahel Süß. I'm a political theorist and a postdoc fellow at the New Institute in Hamburg and at Humboldt University of Berlin. And in my research, I'm interested in the effects of digital technologies on democratic politics. So at the moment, I'm working on a theory of digital democracy. But for today's lecture, what we're going to do is we want to explore the question of what is digital democracy. And I will now share my slides with you. We want to understand better what we actually mean when we talk about digital democracy. So this is what we're going to do today. So we will begin by looking at some of the most prominent debates on digitalization and democracy. And we will do so by working with and through 4 concepts which are relevant for democracy and also democratic theory. Maybe I should say my background is democratic theory very much. So I'm interested especially in this question of democratic theory here. So we will work with these 4 concepts and we will ask what are the effects of digital technologies on the public sphere, on participation, on representation, and also the distribution of power in our societies today. And then we will do so by engaging with some of the most promising examples and case studies of digital democracy experiments. So before I start, I just want to give you a very quick reminder of today's readings. So we shared with you the text by Helen Landermoor on open democracy and digital technologies. So Helen Landermoor is a political scientist and also professor at Yale. She is also a distinguished research fellow at the Institute of Ethics and AI at Oxford University. And she is one of the editors of this book, which is Digital Technology and Democratic Theory. And this is one of the very few conceptual works out there on the topic of digital democracy. So we will come back later to this text and also her concepts of democracy and especially open democracy and open representation. But for now, just keep in mind to have a look at this reading if you haven't done it. So I want to start looking with you at some of the most prominent debates on digitalization and democracy. Because the question here is, of course, why is thinking about the effects of digital technologies on democratic politics important in the first place? And I think there are at least 4 reasons why it's important to engage with this question. So the first one is, I believe it's relevant because personal information has become a main source of revenue. And companies are increasingly using machine learning algorithms to shape and control human behaviors. It is secondly relevant to engage with this question because of privacy violations, fake news, and also electoral threats. So I'm sure everyone still remembers in 2016, the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook. This is just one prominent example here. And thirdly, it is important to engage with the question of digital democracy because we can see that most of the communication and information infrastructure lies actually in the hands of a few billionaires. And this relates to the final point and the question of ownership and control of technology. So here we can think not just of Musk buying Twitter, so he actually just bought Twitter, but we can also think of the role of Musk Starlink satellites in the Ukraine. So besides all these threats of new digital technologies on democratic politics, we can also see that over the last decade, digital technologies have played a leading role in new digital democracy experiments. And here you can see a case studies map. And for example, we can see that in France and in Brazil, citizens have engaged in large-scale deliberation in online spaces on national issues. And other examples, for example, are Iceland and Spain. In Spain, where political parties such as the Icelandic Pirate Party and the Spanish Podemos used digital tools to crowdsource policies, set legislative priorities, and also allocate municipal budgets. So we will hear much more about these digital democracy examples, but I just wanted to make sure that you have like a bit of a broader picture, and you can see that there's a lot already happening when it comes to digital technologies and the question of like how digital technologies can be harnessed to kind of strengthening and deepening democracy. So what is important to remember here is that so far there is no shared definition of digital democracy. So this here is an edited volume by Julie Simon and others from 2017. And this volume looks closely at recent digital democracy experiments. So the one we have seen before, the map on the slide before, so this is part of this book. And what they do is the editors and authors, what they do is they very closely they work with case studies and they look what actually works and what doesn't work in regard to technologies to improve democracy. So this is a well recommended reading, I can say. And so the assumption here is that new digital technologies allow citizens to exercise agenda setting power, create and develop new policies, proposals, and also vote in referenda using on these kind of civic platforms. And what is important here that ultimately the assumption behind all these digital democracy experiments is that using technology, like using these digital platforms, would improve the government's legitimacy and also accountability, and then also leverage greater participation, ultimately better decision, and also more trust. So what is important here is to distinguish these digital democracy experiments from other initiatives like open government and e-governance. Yeah. So maybe you are familiar with the Obama administration and the Transparency and Open Government Memorandum, because this was like in 2009. So this was like kind of the first initiative to promote this kind of e-government. So it goes back to this memorandum. And so the idea is that by putting more government data online, open government initiatives such as the one by the Obama administration aims to foster then exchanges between citizens and governments by using technology or by providing access to this data basically to allow for more online consultation, and then also to enable citizens' collaboration with government officials to ultimately restore accountability through transparency. So let's move on and let's have a look at these 4 concepts. So when we think about digital democracy, so one way of approaching it, so the one way I'm suggesting to do so in today's lecture is like looking at digital democracy and the question of what is digital democracy through like 4 particular concepts. So the first concept we will explore in a bit is the one on the digital public sphere. And the question we are interested in is like, how could the digital public sphere be transformed into a democratic public sphere? So we have we have just heard about like several threats to the public sphere and to democracy. So here we want to understand better like how the digital public sphere could be transformed, that we are actually talking about a democratic public sphere. And then we move on and we want to work with the second concept. And so the second concept we will look at is participation. And the question we are interested in here is, how could digital technology be harnessed to improve the functioning of democratic government? And this question is linked to the digital democracy experiments we have seen on the map. Then the third concept is representation. So again, this goes back to the democracy experiments. And here we will look at Helen Landemore's idea of open representation and open democracy. And the question we want to engage with is, how does digital technology fundamentally reconfigures representative institutions? And then finally, we will also look at power, because we can't think about digital democracy without actually also talking about power. And the question we are interested in here is, how can digital technologies empower citizens in the digital age? And we will see that there is a bit of a distinction between the digital democracy experiments, and the claim here is that while these digital democracy experiments are interested in making democratic institutions more participatory and giving them more legitimacy and giving them more accountability and transparency, like a democratic power approach to digital democracy would focus more on the distribution of power and wouldn't just be interested in how to make these democratic institutions more participatory, but actually changing, really transforming these institutions and also building new ones. So we will now engage with all of these concepts, and we will do so by looking at very particular case studies as well. So let's begin with concept number one, the digital public sphere. And just briefly as a reminder, like the question here is, how could the digital public sphere be transformed into a democratic public sphere? And of course, we can't really talk about this question without also talking about Jürgen Habermas' work. So maybe some of you are familiar with his work on Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit. So this was like one of his kind of it was the most influential work, as he would say, recently, like in terms of also numbers of books being sold. And he just published, I think like 1 month ago or something, he published like a short essay with the title Ein neuer Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit und deliberative Politik, where he basically tries to analyze the effects of new technologies on the public sphere. So Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher, and as I said, he is known for his work on deliberative politics. His work can be located in this tradition of the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. The idea of deliberation is basically the assumption that deliberation leads to more rational and also informed decisions, which then in turn increase the legitimacy of democratic government. So before we just have so what is important here is basically, so before we engage more with his argument, and we will not just do it by looking at his work, but also then we will hear from other thinkers who have been inspired by his work and also develop his work further. But before we go there, I just want to briefly take a step back, and I want to look with you at this emancipatory promise of new technologies and also the internet, right? And so initially, there has been this assumption that digital technologies would drive the cost of bids to zero and therefore enable like free communication and scale beyond central control. So there was this promise of like basically more democracy, more control of citizens over the elites, more possibilities and opportunities for participation, because the idea was that low information costs would reduce the need for gatekeepers and therefore expand opportunities for, as I said, participation, informal communication, and also increase the diversity of perspectives in circulation, and therefore civil society would have like more control over the elites. So this was kind of the emancipatory promise by like new technologies and on the public sphere. So, and obviously, I mean, we briefly have touched on this at the beginning of this lecture. We have seen that, there are several threats to the digital mediated public sphere. So according to Habermas now, we can define so we can definitely see an influence of digital media on the political public sphere, right? But Habermas was saying in this essay that it is not clear whether this change also affects the deliberative quality of public debate. This is, according to Habermas, still an open question. So yeah, maybe we leave it here for the moment. So we will then see later that many of these new civic platforms and many of these digital democracy experiments, they draw on digital technologies to facilitate deliberation. And and we will discuss the potentials and limitations. But let's now move on. Let's move on to Arkon Fang and Joshua Cohen's work on democracy and the digital public sphere. And so Arkon Fang is a professor at Harvard University, and Joshua Cohen is a philosopher who right now is the director of Apple Inc. And there's actually not much so he is not really allowed to talk about what he's doing there. So that's quite creepy, I would say. But so what they do in their work is they heavily draw on Habermas, and what they do is they sketch in this article, which you also find in the Digital Technology and Democratic Theory volume. They sketch an idealized democratic public sphere in an effort to improve digital mediated public spaces. And so what they are suggesting, what we need is we need a tighter government regulation, and we also need more control of private corporations. So the animating idea behind this Habermasian inspired project is a conception of communicative freedom among equals. So the idea is how can we make sure that there are no barriers to this communicative freedom? And this is how their claim goes. So they say, in order to strengthening the communicative conditions, several measurements must be put in place. So remember, when we go back to the question, so how can a digital public sphere be transformed into a democratic public sphere? And they would say, this is what we have to do. So we have to put these measurements in place. So from privacy and security protection to the regulation of speech and powerful private corporations, we also have to produce high quality information and measurements for encouraging participants in the digital public sphere to seek truth and attention, with the attention to the common good. So from a very different perspective, Jennifer Forrester is not so much interested now in formal institutions, but in platform design. So Jennifer Forrester is an assistant professor of political science at Loyola University of Chicago. And in this book, Designing for Democracy, she develops a framework for how to improve platform design for democratic politics. So she argues that social media platforms such as Facebook are important spaces where people associate and engage in the work of collective problem solving. So in this context, she suggests some changes to platform designs. So for Forrester, digital platforms must improve public debates that would build a common word. preserve spaces of appearance, and also invite disagreement. So three aspects are important for transforming the digital public sphere into a democratic public sphere. So we need platform designs which take care of making sure we can build a common world, which is kind of an idea taken by Hannah Arendt, preserve spaces of appearance, so making sure that people can appear, people can be visible, people can access, people can take part, but also then invite disagreements. So what does this mean? So this means that platform designs must allow its members to identify and communicate their common interests, and also encounter a variety of diverse perspectives to ensure that the results of cooperative inquiry are self-correcting. So let's move on to our second concept, which is participation. And here the question is, how could digital technology be harnessed to improve the functioning of democratic government? So as part of engaging with this question, we will look at some of the case studies of digital democracy experiments you have seen in the map at the beginning of the lecture. And we will see that what the digital democracy experiments share is the idea that digital technologies should be used to create opportunities for citizens to participate directly in political decisions that affects their life. So let's have a look at one very prominent example, which is DECENT. DECENT stands for Decentralized Citizens Engagement Technologies. So in DECENT, the central concern for designers was developing technology that would support modes of participation for citizens to have a more direct role in policymaking and also in decision-making. So let's take an example. So, for example, citizens have, like using this platform, have multiple pathways on these digital platforms to have their voices heard, for example, in proposing new legislations or commenting on potential laws, and also voting on laws and city budgets. So it should also be mentioned that digital platforms are often paired with offline experiences and forms of organizations to involve citizens in the political process. So often we're actually talking about some kind of hybrid setting. So let's have a look at 3 examples of decentralized citizens engagement technologies. The first one is Beta Reykjavik. Beta Reykjavik is a social network for citizens with a participatory budgeting platform. So My Neighborhood, for example, is one. So used by the city of Reykjavik, which enables citizens to discuss and propose new policies and also suggest how parts of the city budget would be spent. The second example is Decisions Helsinki. So Decisions Helsinki is a tool employed by the city government to allow citizens to follow notifications of municipal policy decisions that are of interest to them. So this very much talks to this framework of transparency. And then a final example is DECODE Barcelona and also DECIDE Madrid. These are digital participation platforms used by the city of Barcelona and the city of Madrid to enable citizens to propose, discuss, and also vote on policies for the city government. So here I just added one slide which should give you an idea why DECENT is relevant, right? So in here you can see that there are, for very good reasons why to use decentralized citizen engagement technologies such as Decent. And you can see that the first one is like about open technologies, like open authentication technologies, and also distributed identity systems, which are built in these platforms. Then secondly, these citizens own their data and decide what data they want to share. And then thirdly, they run on open source, and also to build and to grow knowledge commons. And then finally, they operate with blockchain trust. So before moving to the concept of representation, let's have a look at another example of a digital democracy experiment. So, and here I want to talk you through one proposal, which is more like a thought experiment at this stage. So political scientist John Gesteel proposes what he calls the democracy machine. And he also says this is not so much actually a machine, it's at this stage more a metaphor. But the idea is the following. So the democracy machine wants to add a meta level to give citizens an overview of their civic participation across different platforms. And because the idea is basically, so the idea is like one limitation identified by Gesteel is that now we can see that citizens participate in different platforms, but the problem is there are no opportunities to develop such a thing like a civic identities, because we have experiences across very different platforms. So what we need is, so this is what he's suggesting, what we need is like a meta level, which connects all these different experiences so that we can actually build a civic identity. And the democracy machine wants to do exactly this. So the idea here is that the democracy machine creates a long-term feedback loop between citizens and the government to boost responsive policy making. So if we have a look at this slide, you can see, so starting at the very left, so the idea is that it starts with that governments or civic organizations create an opportunity for citizens basically to give their input, right? And then we can see that then citizens choose to participate in this consultation process. Then they engage in these high quality deliberations. They come up with some decisions and statements, and then governments have to show that they are actually taking these recommendations seriously, and they have to demonstrate responsiveness to these citizens' input. And then the idea is that this responsive government and civic organizations then gain institutional legitimacy. So the problem at the very root of this democracy machine is, so the idea is that the problem of democracy right now is one of a legitimacy crisis. So the idea here is that we can use digital technologies for boosting legitimacy and also accountability of governments. One interesting aspect of this democracy machine is the idea that to boost participation, the idea is to employ game techniques, also to increase the motivations for citizens to actually engage in these platforms. So, for example, citizens can earn credits for succeeding at finding common ground by deliberating across alliances and also forging coalitions that span diverse alliances. So this very much speaks to this point we have learned from Jennifer Forrester, the idea that we need platform designs that enable citizens to come together and to also bring in all their differences and diverse perspectives to kind of build this common world. Okay, so let's move on to our third concept, which is representation. And the question we will be asking here is, how does digital technology reconfigure representative institutions? And here we're going to go back to the beginning of today's lecture, which is Helen Landemore's work on open democracy. So the article, the reading for today's lecture on open democracy and digital technology builds on her book with the title Open Democracy. So in Open Democracy, Landemore develops an argument for a new democratic regime. And she is particularly interested in non-elected forms of democratic representation. So she criticizes the current representative democracy for having severe limitations. And also she is going on and saying today with new digital technologies actually create opportunities that we can think of representation in a more open and more empowered way. So the basic line of her argument goes like this. So democracy is more than electoral representation. So if we remind us in liberal democratic societies, or in liberal representative democracy, one must say, all citizens rule through majority rule, national elections, and also these representative legislatives. So the very basic idea is that we are all equally entitled to participate in decision makings about laws and policies through fair and free elections. So this is the modern concept of popular sovereignty, where then the people come into existence insofar as everyone formally authorizes laws and policies via individual voting rights. So what Helen Landemore is now doing is she is arguing that today technologies have rendered the promise of deeper democracy more plausible because they allow for constant communication flows between the temporarily represented and the temporary representatives. So she then suggests a model which she calls open representation, which draws on recent democracy experiments such as Iceland and France. And she is interested, or what she's doing in her work is she's basically emphasizing access to power over mere consent and delegation of power to elected elites. So her argument is to say that digital technologies allow for more access to power, right? So before, the representative system made sense because not everyone could be in the room and could debate on topics. But today with new technologies, actually, there are ways that more people can actually be involved in decisions which affect their lives. So at the center of her democracy model is what she calls the open mini public, which is a randomly selected assembly engaged in some agenda setting and lawmaking activities, which then is connected also to the larger population via crowdsourcing platforms and other deliberative forums. So the idea now is that these so-called open mini-publics can be realized with the help of augmented reality tools that enable much larger meetings of what Landemore calls of disembodied and re-embodied individuals, by using also pseudonyms or avatars. Oops. So maybe just to mention, an interesting aspect of her work is that for the future of democracy, Landemore envisions a community of registered members of a system that she calls citizen book, to which every citizen would be automatically registered at birth. And such a system would match its members randomly in chat rooms to discuss collective issues such as climate change and economic inequalities. And and then registered members could also vote on the citizen book in online referenda. So this is how she imagines the digital democracy and the possibilities for the people to be more empowered. But so we have now heard from many different digital democracy experiments, but I think it's important before we move on to just very quickly look at some of the limitations we can find in the literature about these digital democracy experiments. So I think there are at least 4 limitations which are worth mentioning. So the first one refers to digital access and digital skills. So what we can see is that participation in civic engagement systems is often left to those who are already politically active and towards well-educated young men in urban areas. And this is interesting because this is kind of also a critique of the electoral representative system we have right now. So we can see that the people voting or the people who are actually not voting are often the ones who are left behind, right? So this is why what we actually call the legitimacy crisis, that on the one hand, the people who are not voting are mostly the ones left behind, and then politicians are also making like politics for the people who are actually voting. So this is then how the circle closes and is also kind of feeding into this legitimacy crisis. So a second limitation then is that critics have pointed out that innovations have demonstrated a dangerous tendency towards highly technocratic and elitist versions that are participatory, but only in ways that are profoundly disempowering and undemocratic because they reduce participation to consultation exercises. And these consultation exercises are often introduced very much top-down. So this brings us to our third concern, to which online civic participation systems have little measurable impact on policies because crowdsourced citizens' recommendations, for the most part, are actually not binding. And then fourth, online civic participation systems have not only quite little interest from the public, but also provide weak incentives for participation. And we have heard before this idea of employing game techniques, and also Landemore envisions some of these game techniques to be employed to boost their participation and motivate people. But obviously then the question is like, isn't this quite a technocratic vision of these participatory experiments, and how we can actually envision one which is less technocratic and more participatory and more more strengthening conditions which allow people to organize, to collectively organize. And we will hear more about this in a second. So this brings us all to our final concept, which is the concept of power, and the question, how can digital technologies empower citizens in the digital age? To be clear, all of these digital democracy experiments we have engaged with so far, obviously they claim that they are empowering the people, they are making sure to harness digital technologies in ways that they allow citizens to participate in decisions which affect their life. And though there is much to recommend about these digital democracy experiments, I also want to bring in a perspective on these experiments which are a bit more, which I guess challenge a bit this approach of focusing primarily on deliberation and using technologies to foster the deliberation to then strengthening legitimacy and accountability of governments. So let's maybe just take one step back. So it should have been clear up to this point that that so far democratic theories, like especially scholars, scholars like in political theories, in democratic theories, they are only beginning to take note of this importance of these experiments. And we can see that in the literature, also the literature discussed today, we can see a strong deliberative orientation, which means that the scholars mainly engage with, or they focus mainly on discursive power and look into how digital tools can facilitate deliberation, which then leading to more rational and informed decision, and then would increase the legitimacy of democratic government. So the question then here is, if we not only want to make institutions more participatory, if we don't only want to use digital technologies to make institutions more participatory, but if we also want to fundamentally transform political institutions and build new ones, so how do we have to shift our perspective? So what we have to do? So James Muldoon, Roberta Fishley, and I, we show that this focus on deliberation obscures very important questions of power and political transformation. So, and we draw on Stephen Klein's democratic power approach. According to Stephen Klein, democratic institutions are not just formal procedures for settling disagreements, but they are also mechanisms for the realization of power. So when we start from this perspective, conceiving the problem of politics as a lack of opportunities for ongoing discussion, when thinking about digital democracy, is actually not enough, right? Because it obscures, as I just said, important questions of powers and political transformations. So what we have to do is, when we think about digital democracy, we have to also focus on the question of the distribution of power. So it's not enough to just see the problem of politics as a lack of opportunities for ongoing discussion. We also have to think of the problem as a problem of the distribution of political power. So, and I want to give you like an example of what this involves, such a perspective. So an interesting example we can find in DECODE, in the project DECODE. So DECODE stands for Decentralized Citizens-Owned Data Ecosystem. And as you can see here, we are talking about questions of ownership and democratic control. So before, we would talk about issues of transparency, accountability, and legitimacy. And these are all important questions. But if we want to think about digital democracy, we also have to talk about ownership and democratic control and touch upon the question of the distribution of political power. So the DECODE project draws on ideas from the new municipalism movement, which shifts power from the nation state to citizen networks and municipal authorities. And what is interesting of these movements is that they place less emphasis on the institutional design of many publics and instead focus on democratic agency of people organized through social movements and also municipal institutions. So in contrast to certain ideas and forms of politics at the local level, such as these famous New England town hall meetings, this project had a more transformative vision of challenging how power operated and wanting to transform to political institutions. So what are we talking about when we talk about decentralized citizens-owned data ecosystems? So I want to give you 4 examples. So the first one is digital democracy in data commons. So here we are talking about Barcelona, a project by Barcelona City Council, which integrated a new municipalism into the digital democracy software DECODE to enable citizens to sign petitions anonymously, but still using authentication requirements such as place of residence. A second example is citizen science data governance. So again, here we can see an interesting example in Barcelona. So a pilot used citizen place sensors in their homes and neighborhood to gather data on social and environmental issues such as noise levels and pollution to create a municipal data commons through data shared anonymously by citizens. Then a third example is Neighborhood Online. This is a pilot tested more privacy-preserving attribute-based credentials for users to access a local neighborhood social network in Amsterdam, and also to have more control over the data they share. And then finally, the example of Amsterdam's digital register. This pilot enabled citizens to access information stored in a municipal database through blockchain technology to verify their age without having to share their full identity or social security number. So to zoom in, this is an example of how the project DECODE would allow citizens to decide which data they want to collect in the first place, with whom they wanted to share it, and also for what purpose. So here you can see that DECODE would allow citizens to share their data just for 15 minutes, or share their data with the local governments only, or share the data anonymously except for friends and family, or with registered energy suppliers only, share with IP addresses in my city only, or available for common use. So this would be all options for citizens to choose from. So I want to turn to one final example, which is the one on data sovereignty, which is part of the DECODE project. So in Barcelona, so the city of Barcelona, the government of Barcelona made revisions to procurement deals with private companies. And what the city did is they they included a data sovereignty clause so that companies were obliged to provide governments with the data they gathered in a machine-readable format. So this then would allow governments to turn the data into basically a public good. So it would enable the government to make use of the data and turn it into a public good that could then be stored in a privacy preserving manner in the public domain.